I have some words to share with you after this very unusual year. Remember that last Rosh Hashanah we prayed, as we do every year, in the book of life, blessing, peace, and good livelihood, may we be remembered and inscribed before you, we and all your people, the house of Israel, for a life of goodness and peace. By now, we all know how quickly that unraveled. Today, we're just days away from the first anniversary of that Black Sabbath. So it seems most appropriate to speak about October 7th and the repercussions that continue to shake the world to this day. October 7th, 2023 was not like any previous war or battle Israel ever fought. This was nothing short of a genocidal pogrom, something we thought we'd left behind long ago. The Hamas attack took its cues from the Holocaust, from the European pogroms, and from the Farhud, the 1941 massacre of the Jews of Baghdad. Some 6,000 Hamas terrorists attacked southern Israel on foot and on motorbike, by truck, by car, and by paraglider. And they came with a plan. They came to murder, rape, maim, burn, and mutilate anyone they could find. These modern-day Cossacks were equipped with smartphones and GoPro cameras. They called their families, "Dad, Dad, I killed 10 Jews this morning." Some used their victims' cell phones to upload their murders onto their Facebook pages. And in all this, the terrorists were euphoric. The evidence they left behind beggars the imagination. Families tied together and burned alive. Babies beheaded. Women gang raped, murdered, and mutilated. Some 1,200 mostly unarmed Israelis, men, women, and children, were slaughtered during those terrible hours. More than 200 were taken hostage, everyone from toddlers to old people. Over 100 hostages are still being held today. Sadly, only about half are believed to have survived the brutal conditions of their captivity. Some, as we now know, have been executed by their captors. This is why the first analogy the world reached for last year was 9/11. As was true of 9/11, the terrorists caught their victims completely by surprise. As with 9/11, the spectacle and the savagery were the whole point of the exercise. And as with 9/11, the terrorists succeeded in taking not just precious lives, but our sense of safety and security as well. The great difference between 9/11 and 10/7 was the reaction to the horror. Because the catastrophe of 10/7 was followed by a different kind of catastrophe, a moral catastrophe on full display throughout the West, even before the bodies of the victims had been identified. People poured into the streets of cities around the world to celebrate the slaughter. In Sydney, crowds gathered at the Sydney Opera House and chanted, "Gas the Jews." People rejoiced on the streets of Berlin, London, Toronto, and New York. In lockstep, the social justice crowd, the crowd that has tried to convince us that words are violence, insisted that actual violence is a necessity, that rape is resistance when it comes to Israeli women. University presidents offered silence, or else how we need to consider context, how we need to think of both sides, as if there were some kind of moral equivalence between unarmed Jews and jihadists. Most alarming of all were the young people who threw their support not behind the victims of Hamas terrorism, but behind Hamas. At George Washington University, students projected the words, "Glory to our martyrs," and "Free Palestine from the river to the sea" in giant letters on campus buildings. At Cooper Union in Manhattan, Jewish students had to hide in the library from a pro-Hamas mob. At Columbia University, Professor Joseph Massad called the slaughter, and I quote, awesome. At Cornell, Professor Russell Rickford said it was energizing and exhilarating. At Harvard University, more than 30 student groups signed a petition blaming the Jewish victims for their own deaths, saying, and I quote, that they hold the Israeli regime entirely responsible for all unfolding violence. At Princeton University, hundreds of students ominously chanted, "Globalize the Intifada," a phrase which can only mean open season on Jews and Jewish institutions worldwide. And it was just a few weeks ago that over 100 Canadian Jewish institutions, including this one, received emailed bomb threats. Hip young people weren't just chanting these slogans. They were tearing down photos of women and children held hostage in the tunnels beneath the Gaza Strip, and they did so with pleasure. What could possibly explain all this? The easy answer is that most of the people slaughtered October 7th were Jews. And anti-Semitism is, as Robert Wistrick used to say, the longest hatred. But that's not the whole answer, because anti-Semitism is always a symptom of a much broader problem. When anti-Semitism moves from the lunatic fringe into the public square, it's not just about Jews. It's about everyone else. It's about the society, the culture, and the country. It's an early warning system, a sign that society itself is breaking down. It's a symptom that explains how, in the years since 9/11, educated people respond to savagery not with the defense of civilization, but with the defense of barbarism. It's proof positive that the pen really is mightier than the sword. Elite academic philosophies like postmodernism, post-nationalism, and post-colonialism portray Zionists as the white colonialist oppressors of brown indigenous Palestinians. As October 7th revealed, there are consequences for this kind of thinking. And what's happened over time, these ideas have overflowed the boundaries of the academy. They seek to replace basic ideas of good and evil and right and wrong with a new vocabulary, the powerful versus the powerless. It replaced lots of other things as well. Color blindness was replaced with race obsession, ideas with identity, debate with denunciation, persuasion with public shaming, the rule of law with the fury of the mob. Over the last 2 decades, this worldview has swallowed the crucial institutions of North American life. It started with the universities. It moved to the media, the museums, and philanthropy. It's taken root in every major corporation. It's even made its way into high schools and elementary schools. The takeover by this ideology is so comprehensive, we hardly even notice it because it's everywhere. So the year since October 7th has been a mark-to-market moment. In other words, we can see how deeply these ideas run. We see they're more than just metaphors. Decolonization isn't just a turn of phrase or a new way of reading novels. It's a sincerely held political view, a prelude to anti-Semitism and violence. So if you want to know how Jewish students across the continent could be subjected to abuse from their teachers, indifference from administrators, and intimidation from their classmates, it's because they believe that it is just. If you want to know how hundreds of thousands of pro-Palestinian demonstrators could chant, "We don't want 2 states, we want 1," or "We are Hamas," it's because they believe that it is just. If you want to know how the rapists and murderers of Hamas could capture the imaginations of so many of our young people, it's because they believe that it is just. Their moral calculus is about as crude as you can imagine. They see Israelis and Jews as whiter than white, powerful, successful colonizers, so they must be bad. Meanwhile, Hamas is weak and people of color, so they must be good. This is notwithstanding the fact that Israel is itself a nation of refugees. Never mind our ancient roots in that land. Never mind that most Israelis are indistinguishable from their Arab neighbors. So, that murdered baby, he's a colonizer first and a baby second. The hundreds of young people slaughtered at the Nova Dance Festival, the scores of women raped to death. Truly a shame it had to come to that, but they were all white oppressors, weren't they? Into this moral morass, radical Islamists have only been too happy to enter. Over the last 20 years, Islamists have flooded North American universities with billions of dollars and established highly organized action and propaganda networks, forming a toxic alliance with the far-left denizens of university life. Those networks were activated within hours of the news of October 7th. So you see, all those pro-Hamas demonstrations weren't nearly as spontaneous as they appeared to be. If you watched any kind of news this past year, you witnessed anti-Semitic hatred on a massive scale. You saw ugly graffiti scrawled on magnificent buildings and the occupation and destruction of university property. This is the ideology of vandalism in the true sense of the Vandals who sacked Rome in the 5th century. It's the ideology of anti-Semitism, the proliferation of which this past year has been more than we ever thought we'd see in this lifetime. So if there's anything good to come out of the nightmare that began last October 7th, it's this. We've all been shaken awake. Israel has awoken to the fact that it's fighting a seven-front war of annihilation, funded and coordinated by the mullahs of Iran. The first front in Gaza is now winding down, but a second and much bigger front with Hezbollah and Iran is becoming a full-blown war. Many things happen in war, and major challenges for Israel lie ahead. As for us, we should be aware that this is nothing less than a conflict between civilization and barbarism, between the values of Israel and the West, and the values of Hamas and radical Islam, both here and in the Middle East. We all should realize the gravity of the stakes here. They are not merely theoretical. So, the question is, what do we do now? This will be the topic of my Yom Kippur sermon. I realize I've painted a grim picture of what we've experienced this past year, but certainly all is not lost. To begin with, we have our state of Israel with its army, navy, and arguably the best air force in the world. Also, Israel is allied with the United States, still the most powerful nation on earth. And just recently, Israel accomplished the impossible, blowing up the pagers and two-way radios of thousands of Hezbollah operatives, the most precisely targeted counter-terror attack in the history of warfare. And then forced to meet face-to-face, much of the senior command of Hezbollah was neutralized in one fell swoop. And, as we saw last weekend with the elimination of Nasrallah, it may well be that the kingdom of evil has begun to crumble. Moreover, the government of Canada is on our side, even if the BBC, the CBC, and most other media outlets are not. And it's true. The broadcasts of death and destruction from Gaza have been heartbreaking. But the media is only telling one side of the story. October 7th is now a tiny speck in the rearview mirror of most reporting. And the mullahs of Iran, the chief sponsors of all the mayhem, are only now starting to be mentioned. One wonders what the reaction would have been had people been subjected to broadcasts of the deaths of the hundreds of thousands of German civilians killed during the Second World War. Would the Allies have been accused of committing genocide against the people of Germany? Would the world have pressured the US to negotiate a ceasefire with Hitler and the Nazis? In general, my senses were much closer to the beginning of this crisis than the end. But my faith in God and my faith in humanity tells me, Yihiyeh Tov, that all will be well in the end. Perhaps not a quick or an easy end, but maintaining one's faith in the proper outcome of a conflict is at least half the story of any great battle, and this is one of those. In the meantime, I want to wish everyone Shana Tova U'Meduka, as sweet a new year as can be under the circumstances. A year of good health, great faith, the strength to stand our ground, and to see the current crisis to its inevitable end in the victory of good over evil, Israel over its enemies, and civilization over barbarism. And let us all say, Amen. Amen.